Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes running fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Straight Shift. I have been talking for many months now about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the automotive industry. And while I don't want to beat that topic to death because we're all really sick of this pandemic, but some interesting things are happening right now that I think it's important for people to know about, especially if you're going to be in the market for a new car this year. Sales in the automotive industry for 2020 hit record highs. The total numbers haven't quite been tallied yet, but the industry estimates they sold around 14.5 million new cars last year, and the dealers and the automakers made out like bandits. So did stores like Lowe's and Home Depot because all of our vacations were canceled, so instead we apparently spent all of our money on new cars and home improvements. I can definitely attest to the latter. But inventory remains short in the industry for many makes and models. And that's due to a combination of a couple of interesting things. Number one, obviously, the increased sales. The end of the year is always a big selling year, but this past November and December were especially good, and literally all the dealers pretty much sold out of their inventory and makes and models. Come January 3rd, there were so few new cars left, it wasn't even funny. But they are picking that production back up, but now they have run into an interesting other problem that's related to the global supply chain shortages, and an interesting component that you may not immediately think of. Now, we know that last year, nearly every automaker had to shut down their production plants at some point. Usually it happened in the spring due to the lockdowns as we started trying to control, not really successfully, the spread of this virus. But now that we're into 2021, a lot of the makers are having to shut down their plants again. Ford is having to idle its Louisville, Kentucky plant, along with the nearly 4,000 employees that work there. Fiat Chrysler is idling production at their Ontario plant in Canada and their Jeep plant in Mexico. Subaru is having to reduce the number of vehicles produced at their plants, both here in the US and over in Japan. Nissan's cut their Japanese production. Even GM, Honda, Toyota, Volkswagen, Audi, Renault, some of the other European makers that we don't even have here in the US are facing temporary shutdowns or reductions to their production schedules over the next few weeks. Why? Well, you might think because the virus, at least in the US, is still raging out of control, and we have these apparent new strains cropping up around the world that everybody's worried about. But that's not why the plants are shutting down or slowing down. It's because the automakers can't get enough computer chips to build the cars. There is a global shortage of computer chips. It's crazy, right? So today we're going to just geek out a little bit and talk about the evolution of technology in cars, as well as some of the socioeconomic factors that have led to this crazy problem that the automakers are facing right now. If you think about it, cars today are roving computers, and the automotive industry is one of the largest consumers of microprocessors around the world. So let's have a little history lesson. The first use of a computer in a car was for the purpose of engine control, to help control that delicate balance of air and fuel that makes an internal combustion engine work, and more importantly, work well. And one might think it was the Japanese that started using computers in cars, but it wasn't, because they came to the game a little bit later. It was our buddies over in Germany. German over-engineering has a very long history in the automotive industry, but they're responsible for so much of our technological innovations in cars. Volkswagen introduced the very first computer in a car back in 1968. It was a computer-controlled electronic fuel injection system, which was manufactured by the company Bosch, which of course is still a huge player in the industry today. It was offered as standard equipment on their Type 3 models. So if you don't know what a Type 3 looks like, it came out in 61, I believe. And it was a little bigger than the Beetle, which was called the Type 1. We know it as the Beetle. It was officially called the Type 1. But the Type 3, even though they were a little bit bigger, they still had that air-cooled rear-mounted engine and a body-on-chassis construction. So, and they came in some different formats. There was like a fastback and what they called a notchback, which is just a weird term. Google it so you can see what these cars look like. They're pretty cute, but these were kind of the bread and butter of Volkswagen's production back in the 60s and 70s. Prior to the fuel injection technology, which we take for granted now, right? Cars used carburetors to mix the air and the fuel properly for the internal combustion engine to work. So we probably need to have a little bit of a technical lesson here on carburetors and fuel injection and how each works and how they're different and why the industry moved to fuel injection, which was the start of the need for computer technology in cars. Carburetors are old school, and there's a lot of great things about that because they're really simple, and people that, kind of old school guys like my partner Vince on Taz from Rust Rescue, obviously hot rod builders, classic car folks, carburetors are their bread and butter. And a lot of these guys don't want to touch a fuel injection engine with a 10-foot pole because it is a lot more complicated. So carburetors are old school. They are associated nowadays with classic cars, older motorcycles, airplanes, but they're still actually commonly used on small engines. So things like your lawnmower and your weed whacker and other small equipment, they will still use more simple carbureted engines. So what's the difference here? We think of engines as mechanical things, but they're also chemical things. I know we're going back to high school chemistry. I'm sorry, but I promise I will keep this very, very simple. There will not be a lot of math here. Combustion is a chemical reaction. It's what happens when you burn fuel in an oxygen environment, i.e. air that has oxygen in it. And it releases heat energy, as well as producing lovely things like carbon dioxide and water as waste products. And this is true for anything from your car engines to something as simple as lighting a candle, creating a campfire. That's combustion. That is some sort of fuel mixing with air to release heat. With a car engine, an engine works and works efficiently. You've got to kind of finesse it. I mean, obviously, candles and campfires are a heck of a lot easier to achieve combustion, and you don't have to worry about a lot of stuff. But with an internal combustion engine, there's a little more finesse to it because you need to have the right mixture, the right balance between that air and the fuel so that the engine works. And it works efficiently without producing too much of those dangerous waste products that create our air pollution and deadly carbon monoxide, things we do not want. So with the car engine, you have to have that fuel to air ratio be precise enough that you have enough atoms of oxygen to burn all of the atoms of fuel. It gets down to literally that level. In the case of a car engine, that optimal ratio is somewhere around 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. It's kind of like a recipe, right? And every engine's a little bit different, and it depends on the composition of the fuel. But you can use 14.7 as kind of a benchmark for that optimal air to fuel ratio. If you have too much air, but not enough fuel, that's the scenario we call burning lean. If you say an engine is running lean, that's what it means. It's got too much air and not enough fuel. In some cases, this can actually give you better fuel economy, but it can also damage your engine if too much heat builds up. If you have more air than you do fuel, you can build up excessive heat, which can damage your engine. Now, on the flip side, having too much fuel and not enough air, that's what we call running rich. And that can give you a little bit more performance. You get a little more speed out of that, but again, also bad for your engine and your emissions. as those unburned fuel atoms, they can build up carbon deposits on your valves and your pistons, and it gunks up your engine. So you can't have too little, you can't have too much. We have to have that recipe that is just right. Now, a carburetor creates this magical air-fuel ratio in a mechanical way. It relies on the vacuum created by the engine itself to pull the air and the fuel into the cylinders and get that combustion. It's actually very, very simple. And again, that's why carbureted engines are really easy to work on. And carburetors have been around literally since the late 1800s. They were developed by famous automotive pioneer and the later founder of Mercedes, Carl Benz. Again, these nerdy Germans, they're at it again. They're making all these cool things. But the simplicity of relying on that vacuum to create that mixture, it's simple, but it's also, you can imagine, a lot less precise. And the precision that's needed if you want to maximize both your performance and your fuel economy while also minimizing emissions, that takes something a little bit more sophisticated. So hence, here we go with why they invented fuel injection technology. Now, I understand it's probably not always easy to visualize exactly how this works, and I am keeping the explanations at a pretty high level because these things are a lot easier to understand if you really want to see how they work. My recommendation is to go to YouTube and search for how do carburetors work? How does a carbureted engine work? There's some great videos out there with lovely little graphics that really show it. Maybe it's just because me and I'm a visual learner, but I need to see how these things work. So that's why I'm leaving it at a very high level since we only have audio for this podcast. So go out there, get on YouTube, see how these things actually work if you are interested. But fuel injection is a little bit different, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of regular gasoline engines, not diesel engines. They work a little bit differently, and that's a whole nother podcast. But you can think of fuel injectors as being like the spray nozzle on your garden hose. So you go out in your garden, assuming you have one, and you turn on the water at the house, right? And so the water then flows from the water pipes into the hose under pressure and then kind of waits for you to squeeze the trigger on the spray nozzle for then the water to come out. And it comes out under a certain amount of pressure. Well, in your car, similarly, the gas is pumped, again, under pressure from your gas tank to the injectors by your fuel pump. That's what the fuel pump does. And the injectors then open and spray the fuel as a fine mist. They do that because it makes it easier to burn and disperses it better. Now, in most garden hoses, you have the ability to select, to kind of control that spray. You can have a jet, you can have a shower, you can have a mist. If you spent the $15 instead of the $8 on your hose nozzle like I did, you can get some of these different things. And you can also change how much water you get, how much water comes out. Fuel injectors don't give you all of those combinations. It pretty much just sprays a fine mist. But this is where our water hose analogy kind of comes to an end. But since the injectors can't make those decisions and really control how much fuel gets sprayed into the air, so this is how the fuel and the air mixed together. The air is being pushed in. When you put your foot on the gas on the throttle, air also goes through these tubes. And then when the fuel injectors spray the fuel, they're spraying the fuel into the air. That's where it gets mixed before going into your cylinders where combustion happens. But to have that level of control, you need a computer. This is the electronic part of electronic fuel injection. So again, I know I have overly simplified this, and if you're having trouble visualizing it, go to YouTube. They've got some great animated videos out there. But as the automotive industry has worked over the years to optimize that air-to-fuel ratio, they've improved engine performance. The cars have gotten faster, and we've been increasing our fuel economy. We're getting better and better gas mileage. And they really started this to meet the standards for emissions. In the 70s, we had a couple things happen. We had the gas crisis. So I know a lot of you probably aren't old enough to remember that. It's some of my earliest memories of gas prices suddenly going up because of the OPEC oil crisis. And so that's when Americans really started to feel the pain at the pump. We've loved our cars, and we had these big cars, these big, classic gas guzzlers, these muscle cars, that got squat for fuel economy. So now all of a sudden we cared because the price of gas shot through the roof, and it hurt us right where it matters, in the wallet. So also, we were getting more and more cars in the country, and our air quality was showing it. So the government was like, we might want to put some standards on this, or else we're all going to die from pollution poisoning. So in the 70s, we started seeing the first emissions testing and government standards for air quality pushed onto the automotive industry. So this is what made that fuel injection and the computer technology so critically important. All right, I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to talk about what's really going on right now with the global supply chain and why are we experiencing a shortage in computer chips. So we're going to take a quick break. I'll be right back after this. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a great price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 704-248-8706. That's 704-248-8706. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Where the rubber meets the road.
Nice to meet you. Love your asphalt.
Hey, nice treads.
It's Straight Shift with the Car Chick.
Welcome back to the Straight Shift. We're talking about why car production is slowing down right now in January of 2021 because we have a global supply shortage of computer chips. And cars started using computers when fuel injection technology became a thing thanks to Volkswagen. But since then, automakers have added more and more and more computers to cars. I mean, they've added computers to everything in our lives. Our washer and dryer has computers in it. Our stoves have computers in it. I mean, it's kind of scary, actually. This is that whole, George Orwell 1984 thing coming to life. But in cars, we have what they call control modules for everything. So your anti-lock brake system, your steering systems, your suspension, the lighting in the car, all those fancy screens that make up your navigation and the touch screens and what they call the infotainment system, everything. And don't even get me started on those driver safety aid, babysitting technologies, and self-driving cars. That's just computers, more and more computers. So today's cars are actually a mobile network of computers all working together to get you from point A to point B in the most efficient, comfortable, and hopefully entertaining way possible. Now, controlling the engine is still by far the most important and the most processor-intensive job in your whole car. It's what's called the ECU, and it gathers data from dozens of different sensors all over your car. There's sensors all over the engine, in the exhaust, in your wheels. There's sensors everywhere. And so the ECU is able to know everything that's going on in your car. It knows the temperature of your coolant. It knows how much oxygen is being released in the exhaust system versus how much went into the system in the first place. It's using all of that detailed data to perform literally millions of calculations every single second while you're driving. It's kind of mind-boggling. Your car makes way more decisions about your driving than you do. That's a little bit frightening. And none of this is possible, obviously, without those computer chips. which of course the automakers, they don't make computer chips themselves. They get them from other companies. Car manufacturers, and I've said this before, they don't actually manufacture their own cars so much as they assemble them out of building blocks that they source from other vendors. Electronics specifically make up about 40% of the value of modern vehicles, which tells you why cars have gotten so danged expensive in the last several years. But that also is why we have a problem with car production globally currently. This isn't the first time that we've experienced this. The automotive industry was hit. You remember back in 2011, this massive Tohoku earthquake and the ensuing tsunami hit Japan, and ocean water flooded huge factories owned by Renesas Electronics Corp., and that killed production. Renesas Electronics made almost all of the semiconductors, aka computer chips, for the Japanese automotive industry. So Honda, Toyota, Nissan, they had to shut down or slow their car production for months because their main supplier of computer chips was completely out of commission. And you're saying, well, why don't they have these things, kind of stocked up? Why don't they just have a stockpile of these things? Well, car manufacturing follows what's known as just-in-time manufacturing, and that's a concept that the Germans and the Japanese both really refined, back in the 80s, and it's so that you have your supply chain controlled so well and so efficiently that the parts that you need show up literally just in time for you to use them. Therefore, you do not have to have the cost of storing your parts. For the automakers to maintain inventory of all those parts, the storage requirements and the logistics to do that would just make their production costs so much higher that it's much better for them to control their supply chain with their vendors so that the parts arrive just in time to go into that assembly line. So this is where that bites us in the butt, because it means that the automakers do not have a stockpile of any of these parts, any of these computer chips to keep their production lines going. It makes the supply chain a lot more vulnerable to disruptions. And they really had to learn a harsh lesson from the situation with that earthquake in Japan, 10 years ago now. But that led to the automakers thinking, okay, well, how do we diversify our sourcing portfolio across multiple companies, across multiple factories around the world, so that if one company or one geographic area gets hit by something like a natural disaster or even a man-made disaster, that it doesn't kill everything. They don't keep all of their eggs in one basket for certain components. Of course, that creates a whole set of other challenges related to quality control and consistency, but that's another story. We're talking about just supply chain and its effect on production right now. So, here we are again in a similar predicament, but instead of a natural disaster affecting one area and one main company, we have, something that's affecting the entire world. So why specifically is there a shortage of computer chips right now? Well, I talked about how 2020 was a record year, and it started out kind of slow and scary when the pandemic first hit and everybody was locking down and the plants literally stopped operating entirely. And then, people weren't out buying cars in April because we were all at home under quarantine. And everybody in the automotive industry was, of course, terrified. But once everybody was allowed to leave their house again and realized, I'm not going to be getting on a plane and going for vacation, I think I'll buy a car instead, that demand bounced back faster and more furious than any of us in the industry expected. So the surplus of inventory that had built up from March and April, everybody went out and bought it all. So the industry spent the second half of 2020 scrambling to ramp up production to try and meet the demand for these new cars. And they produced more of them, they sold more of them, and it was just more than anybody had expected to do. So that increased their demand for the computer chips to build these cars. But guess what everybody else was buying? Electronic gadgets. We've been upgrading our cell phones, buying laptops and tablets so that we can Zoom and let the kids go to school virtually. We've been buying webcams. We've been buying game consoles so we can stay sane and give the kids something to do. We've been upgrading our TVs. Anything to keep us working and keep our kids learning and keep us all entertained and sane and not kill each other while we're all homebound together. So the automakers have now had to compete for that supply of computer chips with the consumer electronics industry. And I'll tell you, when push comes to shove, the consumer electronics manufacturers are going to win that battle because they're willing to pay more for the chips that they need. And they just pass it along to us, and we don't necessarily think anything of it. We will pay more for these electronic devices, but it's a little more difficult for the automakers to pay more for those chips and then change the cost of their cars. The market, as consumers, we're much more sensitive to price changes and increases in cars than we are in our cell phones. So the chip manufacturers, they've been limited themselves in how much they can ramp up their production. You just think, oh, that's just easy. Why can't they just spit out more computer chips to meet the demand? Well, adding new plants or even expanding the existing plants for this specific production of semiconductors, aka microprocessors, computer chips, that's just not an easy thing to do. Those factories have some very, very specific requirements that make it expensive and complicated to build more of them or to expand the existing ones. It's not something that can typically be done in a matter of weeks or even months. Sometimes it takes a couple of years to get one of those plants built or expanded. So it's not something that they could just ramp up more production to meet the overall demand. They're spitting them out as fast as they can, but there are limits. And then on top of that, there was a major fire at one of the biggest Japanese semiconductor plants back in October, so that didn't help matters any either. Now, to further complicate it, let's just add insult to injury. We sort of have had this little trade war going on with China. So, like most other products that we buy these days, semiconductor manufacturing has shifted to China over the last several years. They, quite frankly, they've got more land to build these plants on. They've got people, they've got the labor to staff them and to staff them cheaply because China does not have labor protection laws like most of the rest of the world does. And they also don't have the environmental protection laws because the production of computer chips, semiconductors, is not necessarily the most environmentally friendly form of manufacturing. So because China doesn't give a rat's ass about any of these things, they have taken over a lot of that production, and they have some huge, huge companies that provide so much of the world's supply of semiconductors. About 56% of global computer chip manufacturing is actually done by a single company. They're called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And while the automakers themselves don't tend to buy the chips directly from this company, they buy them from other companies that design and build the overall components that use these computer chips. So, the automaker like Ford doesn't necessarily buy computer chips directly, but they do buy these modules that are built by companies that specialize in automotive electronic components, but they're buying the chips from this company and other companies. So through the pass-through effect, that's why we're feeling the kind of that part of the supply chain has just been strangled off because we've had to shift and we literally can't get the computer chips from this company because of the trade war that's going on. So, there's a shortage in the world anyway, and now all of a sudden we're cut off from one of our biggest suppliers of said chips. So yeah, we're exacerbating the problem. Now, kudos to Bosch, the German company that made the first computer chip and continues to make computer chips. They are busting butt to increase production and negotiate new agreements with all these companies to help the automakers meet their needs. But this is not a situation that's going to be resolved quickly, and it's probably going to cause some production shortages of certain make and model vehicles, at least through this summer. It may even push into fall. A lot of stuff really is just going to depend on how a lot of stuff shakes out, over the next couple of months, both with the pandemic and with changes in our administration. And hopefully we can come to some better trade agreements with China as well that benefit both sides. So what does this mean for car buyers this year? Number one, it means that our new car dealerships are going to have a lower inventory levels of certain makes and models. Now, I don't think it's going to get to the point where they're completely out of a lot of models. What they're doing is they're looking at, okay, what are our best selling models, and let's shift the procurement of the computer chips to those models so that we make the demand, and we'll slow down production of maybe these other models that don't sell as well this time of year, or just are a little bit lower on our priority list to build. So it will depend on the specific make and model you're looking for. And it will also depend on where in the world that specific make and model is built and who their vendors are for the various components. They're working hard to shift around that supply chain and get new vendor agreements, but it can vary a lot, and not every make and model sources their components from the exact same vendors. It gets very complicated. So a lot of that is just going to depend on how much the industry can shift and where they can focus their production efforts to most effectively use the chips that they can get their hands on in order to meet consumer demand for certain models. You may have to order the car that you want, and you may have to wait a little longer for that order to be fulfilled. So if you're worried about, oh gosh, ordering a car, am I going to have to pay full price? Go listen to episode 69 of The Straight Shift, where I talk about how to order a car and still get a great deal. It can be done. But in general, car buyers are going to need to be even more savvy negotiators and shoppers, even shopping outside your geography than ever before. It's just going to take a lot more savvy and effort on your part to get a great deal, especially if you're interested in a vehicle where the supply is low. You might want to consider some different makes and models if it's just doesn't seem to be feasible to get what you really, really want. And I hate suggesting that anybody settle. I don't think anybody should have to settle, but hello, we're in weird times, and sometimes we have to adjust, because if you need a car now, you need a car now, and you just kind of got to go with what the market has. But you might consider a gently used model. We had a lot of cars, the leases came due at the end of last year and people couldn't extend them anymore. So we did see a lot of good, about 3-year-old cars, 2 to 3-year-old cars being traded in at the end of last year. So there's a lot of that good stuff now hitting the dealers' used car lots and certified pre-owned lots. Now, on the flip side of that, it means if you have a car to trade that's in good condition, you should be able to command top dollar for it, because obviously anytime there is a supply shortage, either on the new car side or the used car side, it jacks up used car prices as people shift the demand from the new ones that they can't get to, oh, maybe I'll buy a used one instead. So used car prices are still high. They're a little softer this month because of the lease turn-ins, but you should still be able to get some good money if you have a good trade. So don't let the dealers steal your trade. Shop it around. Now, I anticipate, and this is where I'm getting into very much the speculation, but I don't think we're going to see another record year like we did last year for the demand for cars. I think that's going to drop off, at least for the first and second quarters, because we're, number one, we're still continuing to fight this crazy pandemic, especially here in the U.S. A lot of the people that were in the financial position to take advantage of some of the deals last year and to buy a new car last year have done so. There's still quite a few people that haven't, so they are looking at 2021 to make a purchase. I just don't think it's going to be quite the demand frenzy for cars that we saw last year. So, and I'm not just making these wild ass guesses. I actually do have a degree in quantitative economics from Stanford. So I never thought I'd be applying it like this to the automotive industry, but I do look at the markets and I watch it from the global economic perspective. So I'm not just making stuff up, but I could still be wrong. We were all wrong last year and we could all be wrong again this year. So, demand will probably start to increase again once the weather starts getting warmer, and depending on how the vaccine rollout expands and people start getting a little bit more comfortable and feeling safer going out and about and doing things. And, maybe going back to work more. A lot of people have delayed car purchases because they're like, why do I need a car? I don't leave my house. I'm working from home. The kids are home. We're not going anywhere. But as that changes and hopefully life starts returning to something that resembles normal. If I cannot go on my Alaska cruise again this September, I am going to scream. But I think as we start getting on the tail end of this craziness, that the demand will start to settle out again, and hopefully we'll be able to get production ramped up at the same time. But no matter what happens, there is never a dull day in the automotive industry, and there are always ways to get a great deal on what you want. You just have to be savvy about it. Or if you want to talk about your situation and bounce some ideas off of me, or even talk about, how can I help you still get a great deal on a car despite the craziness, you guys can always reach out to me, even if you just have questions, at thecarchick.com. Reach out. I'm here for you guys, and I'm obviously passionate about educating you and giving you this information that you need to make smart decisions when it comes to buying, selling, and servicing your cars. So thank you so much for listening to The Straight Shift. Have a great weekend. I'm out of here.
The Straight Shift podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or The Car Chick.